In this part of the tutorial, we're going to look at deploying a Unity application on the web or on the PC or a Mac using the build settings. In the current project, we have two scenes. The first one is what you've been seeing or working on in the NGUI tutorial. This is basically a 2D UI with a few interactive controls. And the second scene is basically a scene that has a few game objects thrown in with some lighting. Scene 1 fades the UI and then calls scene 2 to be loaded. Let me show you how that happens. So if you've been following this tutorial, you can see that we had written an input controller script which basically caused the progress bar to start filling up. And when the progress bar filled up, we changed the opacity of the UI and we faded it out. And now using this single line of code, we can tell our application to load the next scene or scene 2. So basically what's going to happen is the UI is going to come up in scene 1. We're going to toggle the play or toggle between the play and quit options using the arrow controls. The progress bar is going to appear and start filling up. And as soon as the progress bar is filled up, the UI will fade out and scene 2 would be loaded. Okay, let's take a look at how this works. So I'm going to hit the play button. So my UI is interactive. I'm going to hit the enter key. My progress bar is going to fill up. The UI is going to fade away and scene 2 is going to show up. But no, it doesn't. So scene 2 did not show up. So does that mean that this line of code didn't get executed? No, that's definitely not the case. What actually happens is when you press the play button, Unity builds the application and runs it. But you have to explicitly tell it which scenes it must build. And so right now, since we're in play mode for scene 1, it's built scene 1, but it doesn't know that it has to build scene 2 in order to give you the experience that you're looking for. So the way to do this is explicitly tell Unity which scenes amongst your project do you want to really build. So let's go ahead and specify that using the build settings. So I went to File, and I'm going to select the build settings option from the file menu. Now here I'm going to see that scene 1 has already been added, and if for some reason you don't see anything over here, you can go ahead, open scene 1 and click add current. So it's going to go ahead and add scene 1 to my build settings. Similarly, I'm going to go ahead and select scene 2. Once that loads, I'm going to click add current to add scene 2 to my build. Okay, so I've added these two scenes to the build settings, and now let's see if my hypothesis about explicitly specifying scenes makes a difference. So I'm going to close the build settings, I'm going to return to scene 1, and now let's hit play again. So I'm going to hit the enter key, progress bar fills up, the UI blends away, and voila, you have scene 2. And what we can do is we can also go back to the build settings, and let's say scene 2 was not the scene that you wanted. You could simply hit the delete key, or on the Mac you could hit the command delete key to remove a scene from the build settings. But for now, we're going to go ahead and add current. So add scene 2, and that's going to be in our build settings. So it's crucial that you explicitly tell Unity which scenes it has to build. Now that we've seen how to add scenes to the build settings menu, let's take a look at some other options that will help us control the build. Let's go to the build settings. And as you can see, both my scenes from the project have been added in this build. Before I go ahead and click build, let's take a look at the player settings options. So when I click player settings, I had the inspector show me various settings, and in the inspector, you can see there are settings around resolution and presentation, around attaching a splash image or various icons, etc. Let's start with the first one at resolution and presentation. So the typical settings are provided for you, but sometimes you need to make a few changes. For instance, under the resolution and presentation option, the current setting for the display resolution dialog is set to enabled. If you're releasing a game on the App Store or on Steam or whatever, you might want this to be disabled. For now, I'll keep it enabled to show you what this display resolution dialog looks like. Then under the icon option, you have an icon that you can set for various resolutions for your game. Under the splash image, you have a config dialog banner. This is basically another image that might appear on the display resolution dialog that we spoke about in this part of the settings. And amongst other settings, you have a few settings that help you control various options surrounding rendering. So things like dynamic batching or GPU skinning. You can also choose the kind of optimization that you want. And as I said, usually the typical settings work just fine, but in some cases you might need to make a few minor changes. So now that you know what these settings look like, let's go ahead and build this app for the desktop. So I'll go back to my build settings dialog, and here I'm using a Mac. The process is exactly the same if you're building for Linux or Windows. So go ahead and choose PC, Mac, and Linux standalone. And now in the target platform, choose the platform that you're running on. I'm going to go ahead and select Mac OS X. And yes, I do have the x86 architecture. And I'm going to press the build button now to build my app. So the moment I press the build button, it's going to ask me where I'd like to store the build or the binary files that are generated from the build. So typically, I like to go ahead and create a separate folder for my binary files called bin. And in this case, I'll actually go ahead and create a separate folder which tells me that this is where I'm going to be storing my Mac OS build. And let's call this my game. Now I'll click save, and now Unity will start building this app for me. Voila. Once the build is completed, you can see that I have the executable stored in the destination that I had specified. If I double click this, I will now see the display resolution dialog. If you remember in the player settings under resolution and presentation, we had set the display resolution dialog to be enabled, and this is what it looks like. So this allows me to choose from different screen resolutions and different rendering qualities, and whether I want this to run in a window or not. There is also another option to make sure that this doesn't show up again after the first run. For now, I'm just going to go ahead and click play so we can see what the game looks like. And this is the game being loaded. And as you can see, I can interact with it. If I hit enter, I'll see my progress bar. And now the second scene would get loaded. So this is a standalone app now that's running in its own window outside of Unity. And this is how you deploy your application on the desktop. Cool. Let's do another build, but this time let's do it for the web. So I'm going to go to build settings, and this time I'm going to say deployed for the web player. And so it asks me if I want it to be deployed. Yes, I would like offline deployment. So I'm going to select that, and I'm going to go ahead and click build. And just like with my build for the Mac, I'm going to create another folder. Let's call it web build. And we'll call this my game web. And now let's go ahead and click build. Okay, looks like our game has been built for the web. And as you can see, this has actually generated a lot of JavaScript and HTML files. So what you want to do is, if you want to play the game, you just want to double click the HTML file, which will then open it in a browser. Now when you do that, Unity will so before we get into just showing you how this game runs on the web, let's take a moment to talk about what actually goes on here. So Unity provides a web plugin for most browsers, and that typically has to be installed before you run it. If the plugin is not found by the browser, it will prompt you to install it. And what this plugin essentially does is takes that intermediate bytecode that we were talking about and renders it in the browser by probably making a call similar to WebGL or something that's specific to that browser. And the reason we can do all this is because we had the Mono framework running to help us translate our application into a common language bytecode and then be able to run it using the platform specific uh, constructs, whether it's for a Mac OS or whether it's for a browser. So I'm going to go ahead and allow this plugin to run on my browser. And now this will load the app. Now if I click on it, you can see that I can interact with it using my arrow keys. When I hit the return key, the progress bar fills up and the next scene should be loaded. So you've seen how to build your application, add different scenes to the build, and deploy it on the desktop and web platforms. Hopefully this helps you as you make your own games moving forward. Thanks for watching this tutorial.